The sun was setting as Daniel played with his friends, his laughter filling the air. Suddenly, without warning, he collapsed. His friends screamed, calling for his parent. Amma ran from the house, her heart pounding. "Daniel, wake up," she cried, kneeling beside her son. His eyes were closed, his body still. Inside, Eric heard the panic in his wife's voice and rushed out. Seeing his son lying on the ground, unresponsive, sent shockwaves through his body. "What happened?" he stammered, kneeling beside Amma, who was desperately shaking Daniel, trying to wake him up. "He just fell all of a sudden. Eric, he's not waking up." Amma's voice cracked with fear. Eric rushed to call for an ambulance, his hands shaking. Minutes later, they were speeding to the hospital, fear gripping their hearts. At the hospital, they waited anxiously. Finally, Dr. Paul emerged from the room, his face grim. "I'm afraid Daniel is very sick," he said. "He has a rare disease and it's affecting his organs at a rapid rate, and without immediate attention, he won't make it. He'll need surgery and treatment abroad. We don't have the knowledge or the facilities to treat such a disease." Amma clutched Eric's arm, her eyes wide with tears. "How much will it cost, doctor?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Paul sighed. "It will cost at least $100,000 for the surgery and follow-up treatment." The doctor further said, "You guys should be fast on your actions, because the chances of him surviving for long are slim." Eric's heart sank. "We don't have that kind of money," he said, feeling hopeless. The doctor sighed sympathetically. "I understand this is overwhelming, but time is of the essence. We'll do what we can to sustain him, but you'll need to make arrangements quickly." The weight of the doctor's words hung over them as they stared at their son, who lay unconscious on the hospital bed. How were they going to save him? Where could they find the money? It felt like the walls were closing in on them, suffocating any hope they had left. As they went home, the weight of Daniel's diagnosis pressed down on them like a heavy cloud. Neither spoke, lost in their own fears and grief. Eric's mind raced, filled with shame and despair. How could they save their son when they couldn't even afford the treatment he needed? "We'll find a way," Amma whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. Little did anyone know that behind Amma's worried facade lay a darker truth. While her son's life hung in the balance, her mind was already turning toward something else, something far more selfish. But soon, news of Daniel's illness spread throughout the community, and a spark of hope appeared. The people who loved Daniel was willing to help. The news of Daniel's illness spread quickly through the small city. The community, close-knit and compassionate, was shocked to hear about the boy who was so full of life suddenly facing such a grim fate. At church that Sunday, Pastor Williams addressed the congregation with a heavy heart. "Daniel is one of our own," he said, his voice somber. "His family needs our help. The surgery is expensive, but if we come together, we can give Daniel a chance to live." The response was overwhelming. The people organized fundraisers, sold items, and even donated what little they had. Everyone came together for Daniel. From the poorest family to the wealthiest, they contributed whatever they could. In a matter of weeks, they raised $100,000. Amma and Eric were overwhelmed when Pastor Williams handed them the check. "We're so grateful for all your help," Amma said, tears streaming down her face. Eric stood by her side, nodding quietly, his face tight with emotion. "We'll make arrangements for the surgery immediately," Amma added, smiling through her tears. But behind closed doors, Amma had a different plan. Before Daniel's sudden illness, she had been seeing a secret lover, a man named Charles, a wealthy businessman, behind Eric's back. Charles had promised her a life of luxury, far away from her struggles. She had grown tired of the modest and struggling life with Eric, his constant gambling and joblessness. The donations from the community seemed like the perfect opportunity. She plans to escape with most part of the money with Charles. Having sinister plans in mind, Amma decided to play along with the current situation. As the days went by, the community eagerly awaited news of Daniel's upcoming treatment abroad. But behind the scenes, dark thoughts started lingering. Amma couldn't stop thinking about the money. Could they really spend it all on surgery with no guarantee Daniel would survive? Late one night, as she sat by the window, she turned to Eric. "What if we didn't take him for the surgery?" she asked quietly. Eric stared at her, shocked. "What are you saying, Amma?" Amma's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. "We don't have to take him," she repeated, her eyes hardening. "Think about it, Eric. Even if he has the surgery, there's no guarantee he'll survive." Eric shook his head, confused and angry. "This is our son we're talking about, Amma. How can you say that?" Amma stood up and began pacing the room. "You don't understand. Even before Daniel got sick, we were drowning in debt. You're gambling, the bills. We can barely keep up. And now, the community has given us all this money. We could use it to escape. Start afresh." Eric felt a lump form in his throat. He looked away, not wanting to face the reality of their situation. Amma was right about one thing. Their lives had been a constant struggle. But to steal money meant to save Daniel's life. It seemed unimaginable. "We can't do this," Eric said, his voice shaky. "Daniel needs that money." Amma stopped pacing and faced him. "Eric, he's going to die. Even with the surgery, the doctor said there's little chance. Are we going to throw away this opportunity, this money, and still lose him? Or are we going to use it to secure our future? You know we could always have another child." Eric couldn't look her in the eye. Deep down, the temptation gnawed at him. They could be free. No more debts. No more worrying. The idea was planted, and no matter how much he resisted, it took root in his mind. Days passed, and Daniel's condition worsened. The community continued to ask when they would take him abroad for the surgery. Amma and Eric gave vague answers, always saying they were making arrangements. But in truth, no such plans were being made. They had decided to keep the money. At first, it started small. Amma used a portion to pay off some of Eric's gambling debts. Then, she bought new clothes, justifying it as preparation for Daniel's trip. Soon, they were living more comfortably, but they knew the community would start asking questions if they weren't careful. "You can't keep spending like this," Eric warned as he watched Amma unbox another expensive outfit one evening. "People are going to notice." Amma shrugged, a faint smile on her lips. "We'll just say it's for the trip. No one will suspect anything." But Eric wasn't as confident. He had grown more distant, the weight of their decision pressing down on him. Every time he looked at Daniel, lying weak and helpless, he felt sick to his stomach. Guilt consumed him, and he found himself drinking more and more to numb the pain. "We've made our decision," Amma reminded him coldly. "There's no going back now. We just need to keep up appearances." Eric nodded, but deep down, he knew this was only the beginning of their problems. As Daniel's condition continued to deteriorate, Amma grew more restless. She knew they were running out of time. People would soon start asking why Daniel hadn't left for his treatment. Amma, ever calculating, realized that they had to act quickly to avoid suspicion. One evening, she sat across from Eric at the dinner table, her face cold and determined. "We need to talk," she said. Eric looked up from his drink, his eyes dull with guilt. "What now?" he muttered. Amma's voice was calm, almost too calm. "We can't let Daniel die naturally. If he does, people will ask questions. They'll wonder why we didn't use the money to save him. They'll start digging, and we can't afford that." Eric stared at her, his blood running cold. "What are you saying?" Amma leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to help him along. Make it look like his illness finally took him." Eric recoiled, horrified by the suggestion. "You're talking about killing him, Amma. How can you even think that?" Amma's expression remained emotionless. "It's the only way. If we don't, they'll find out everything. The money, the lies. We'll lose everything." Eric was torn. His guilt was overwhelming, but Amma's words cut deep. They had come this far. Could they really turn back now? The thought of losing everything was too much to bear. After a long pause, Eric nodded slowly, his heart heavy with despair. There was no turning back now. The house was eerily quiet that night. Eric sat by Daniel's bedside, his heart pounding. He could barely look at his son, whose frail body was wrapped in a blanket. Daniel's breaths were shallow, each one a reminder of the innocence that would soon be lost. Amma stood in the doorway, watching with cold eyes. "It has to be done, Eric," she whispered. "It's the only way." Eric's hand trembled as he held the vial of medication. His chest tightened, and his vision blurred with tears. He had never imagined he would reach this point. But now, standing on the edge of no return, the weight of what he was about to do crushed him. "I love you, Daniel," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. Daniel didn't respond. He was too weak, barely aware of what was happening. Eric poured the lethal overdose into a cup of water and lifted it to his son's lips. Daniel drank without protest, trusting his father completely. Eric's heart shattered as he watched the boy's eyes slowly close. His breathing became even more shallow until, finally, it stopped. Daniel was gone. Eric collapsed to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. "What have we done?" he cried, his body trembling. But Amma remained emotionless. She stepped forward, checked Daniel's pulse, and nodded. "It's done," she said flatly. "Now we have to act fast." The next morning, they played their roles. They called the neighbors, their voices full of fake grief, and announced that Daniel had died peacefully in his sleep. The community mourned with them, never suspecting the horrible truth behind the tragedy. The community was heartbroken by Daniel's death. People came to offer their condolences, bringing food and prayers for Amma and Eric. Amma put on a convincing performance, crying and thanking everyone who came to the house. Eric, however, struggled to maintain his composure. The guilt weighed heavily on him, and he could barely speak without choking up. "We did everything we could," Amma told Pastor Williams, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "But it wasn't enough." "He's in a better place now," Pastor William reassured her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did everything you could for him." But not everyone believed the story. Dr. Paul, who had been treating Daniel, was puzzled by how quickly the boy had died. "Something doesn't add up," he told one of his colleagues at the hospital. Daniel's condition was serious, but it wasn't immediately life-threatening. Word of Dr. Paul's doubts spread through the community, and soon, people began asking questions. Why hasn't Daniel been taken abroad for the surgery? What had happened to the $100,000 raised for his treatment? Neighbors also noticed that Amma and Eric seemed to be living more comfortably than before. New clothes, a new car, things that didn't add up for a family supposedly grieving the loss of a child. Eric's guilt grew unbearable. He drank more to numb the pain, but the questions wouldn't stop. He could feel the pressure closing in, and with each passing day, he was closer to breaking. Amma, however, remained calm, insisting they stick to their story. "They won't find out," she said confidently. "Just keep quiet, and everything will blow over." But Eric wasn't so sure anymore. The community's growing suspicions reached the local authorities. One afternoon, police officers arrived at Amma and Eric's home, their faces serious. "We've received some concerns from the community about Daniel's treatment," one officer said. "There are questions about how the donation money was used." Amma smiled politely, though her heart raced. "Of course. Please, come in." The officers asked for details about Daniel's treatment. People want to know why Daniel wasn't taken abroad for the surgery. The funds were raised, but no arrangements were made for the trip. "Can you explain?" Amma remained composed, her voice steady. "We were planning the trip, but Daniel's condition worsened too quickly. We didn't have time to take him abroad." The officer nodded but pressed further. "And what about the money? The community raised $100,000. Where did it go?" "We used some of it for his care here, locally," Amma replied smoothly. "The rest was meant for the trip, but we never got the chance to use it." Eric, sitting in the background, could barely breathe. His hands shook as the officer continued asking questions. "What about the new car and the expensive items people have noticed?" the officer asked, his tone sharp. Amma's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "We bought those things in preparation for the trip. We didn't want to look like we couldn't afford proper care for Daniel." The officers didn't seem convinced, but without solid evidence, they couldn't press further. They left the house, but Amma and Eric knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. Eric's guilt was suffocating. He couldn't keep living with this lie. Eric had reached his breaking point. The weight of his guilt was too much to bear, and he had turned to alcohol to drown his sorrows. But no matter how much he drank, the truth kept bubbling to the surface. Every night, he dreamed of Daniel, his innocent face haunting him. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw the face of a man who had betrayed the most innocent part of his life. He couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep, and now he couldn't even drink away the pain. One evening, as he staggered through the streets, avoiding the accusing stares of the neighbors, he found himself wandering toward Daniel's grave. It was a small, quiet spot on the edge of the cemetery, marked with fresh flowers from the community. The sight of it brought fresh waves of pain crashing over him. He fell to his knees in front of the grave, clutching the cold earth in his hands. "I'm sorry," he sobbed, his voice breaking into the quiet evening. "I'm so sorry, Daniel. I should have saved you. I should have been better. I should have." His words dissolved into raw, guttural sobs. For the first time since Daniel's death, Eric let himself feel the full weight of his grief, his shame, his guilt. He stayed there for hours, until the sky darkened and the air grew cold. He had nothing left but the crushing realization that he had let his son die for the sake of money that hadn't even brought him peace, only torment. The next morning, when Amma awoke and couldn't find him in the house, she assumed Eric had gone to drink again. But when she checked the kitchen and found his phone and keys still on the counter, something felt off. Hours passed, and by midday, the truth came out. Eric had walked straight into the police station that morning, unshaven and haggard, with tear-streaked cheeks and trembling hands. He had stumbled through the doors and collapsed in front of the officers, sobbing uncontrollably. "I killed him," Eric cried, his voice hoarse. "We killed our son. We killed Daniel. I did it." The officers stared at him in shock, unsure how to respond to the man who had broken down before them. But Eric didn't stop there. Between sobs, he spilled every detail: the money, the lies, the deceit. How Amma had convinced him to keep the funds. How they had made the decision to let Daniel die, and finally, how they had killed him with a fatal dose of medication. By the time Eric finished, there was nothing left of him. He had laid his soul bare, revealing every dark, twisted corner of the nightmare that had consumed his life. The weight of the secret had crushed him beyond repair, and now, in the cold light of the police station, he felt nothing but empty. Within hours, Amma was arrested at their home, charged with conspiracy to commit murder and fraud. She didn't struggle. She didn't even cry. Instead, she glared at Eric as she was led away in handcuffs. "You fool," she hissed. "You ruined everything." Eric, too broken to respond, simply lowered his head. It was over. The truth had finally come out. The trial that followed shook the entire community. The truth about Amma and Eric's betrayal was revealed in excruciating detail: the lies, the stolen money, and worst of all, the murder of their own son. The community, once so supportive and trusting, was horrified by what they learned. How could the same people they had rallied behind, the same people they had given their hearts and hard-earned money to, have been capable of such evil? Amma, always the manipulator, tried to shift the blame onto Eric, but the evidence was overwhelming. Both were found guilty of fraud, conspiracy, and murder. Eric was sentenced to life in prison, and Amma received the same fate. In the community, the once united neighbors were left shattered by the betrayal. Daniel's death, once seen as a tragic loss, became a painful reminder of how greed and deception could destroy even the closest bonds. People whispered about the couple, unable to comprehend how they could betray their son and the very people who had tried to help them. Amma, now sitting alone in her prison cell, received the final blow when she learned that her lover, the man she had hoped to run away with, had somehow disappeared with the rest of the money. She was left with nothing but the cold, hard truth of her own actions. Eric, consumed by guilt, spent his days in silence, haunted by the memory of the son he had betrayed. He could never forgive himself for what he had done. The small city, forever changed, would never forget the cautionary tale of Amma and Eric, the parents who chose greed over their own child and paid the ultimate price. Truth, they say, the love of money is the root of all evil. Please like and subscribe. It may look simple for you, but for us it's very valuable and it keeps us pushing to provide more interesting stories and tales, not just for your entertainment, but also for you to gain new experiences in life, to tackle new encounters. Thanks so much for your support.